I'm Catherine Sheeran, host of the podcast Horse Tales with Cat. Our guest today is an icon in the world of show jumping. Katie Monahan-Prudent won the Maclay Medal finals at 14 and the AHSA Medal finals at 18. She rode in her first World Cup final in 1979, where she finished second. Interestingly enough, it was also the first World Cup final ever. She was named to the U.S. Olympic team in 1980. She was a member of the 1986 gold medal winning World Championship show jumping team. She won the American Invitational in 1983, 1985, and 1988. She was also named American Grand Prix Association Rider of the Year in 1982, 1986, and 1988. In 2016, Katie Monahan was inducted into the Show Jumping Hall of Fame. She was also named Coach of the Year for Developing Riders by the U.S. Olympic Committee. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you.
So I really wanted to start with your early days because I know you started riding at the age of 5 in Chicago. So I would love it if you could share with our listeners just a little bit about those early days, because you had amazing success at a very unusually early age.
I did, and I would have to say it was because of just great luck. My parents knew nothing about horses. I started riding, funnily enough, at the farm of Martha Jane, one of the relatives of the Janes who are still competing these days, a big horse family. And I fell in love with one of the school horses, a little quarter horse mare called Tina, who had been the 1954 barrel racing champion of the state of Illinois. And what I loved about her was they would let us ride with no tack, with just a rope around the neck. And of course, being a quarter horse, she neck reined beautifully. She stopped with just a little tug. I was hooked. My life with horses was just about playing with them all the time. My parents bought Tina, and she took me all the way to Madison Square Garden. She was an amazing jumper. She was an amazing, great horse. I was state champion with her, I think both in Illinois and then when we moved to Michigan, also state champion. And as I said, I competed on her at Madison Square Garden my first year. I think it was 69, 68.
Wow. And then if I'm not mistaken, you went to train with George Morris after winning, or maybe I have that confused.
I went with him when I was 14.
Okay.
And he's the one who made my career. Gave me great motivation looking forward to jumpers and the team and going to Europe and all the things that doing the jumpers well meant in those days. He was very instrumental in my career.
And how did the two of you connect? Because I thought I read that he loaned you a horse for the finals because something had happened with the horse you were supposed to ride, or what was the story there?
In those days, I rode a lot of hunters, and I rode hunters for a very prominent judge in the Midwest, a great lady named Sally Sexton. I know you've probably heard of her. She judged the Royal many times, and we competed at the Royal on her hunters. And Sally said to me, she's a crusty old gal, and she said, if you're ever going to win the finals, you've got to ride with George Morris. Great, I'd love to. And we decided that year, she decided that we would show her hunters on the East Coast at 2 horse shows on Long Island called North Shore and Piping Rock. And we went out there, and she introduced me to George Morris and sort of put me with George. When I was 14, my mother died of cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My dad was then taking care of me alone. And when Sally offered to help get me with this great trainer, my dad said, well, great. Because already at that age, there was nothing in my life that I wanted to do but ride. Nothing. So at that time, I went with George, trained with him all summer long, went back to Michigan. Then in those days, we had moved to Michigan. Every waking moment that I could, I went with George. My dad got me a special driver's license. I was 15. I hooked up the 2 horse trailer, now I had 2 quarter horses, put 2 quarter horses in the trailer and drove out to George Morris.
Wow. What an opportunity at such an early age.
Really, yes.
Do you have siblings? Were you an only
No.
child?
Only child.
Wow. Okay, so this was beyond going to George Morris, this was also a big life event. Your mother passed away. You were heading out on your own. You obviously had something in you from a very early age. Would you say you felt that you had this focus and passion?
I have often said this, and I truly believe it. It came from another lifetime. I had so much feeling for horses. My parents knew nothing about horses. My dad was an engineer, my mother a housewife who had never ridden. Neither of them had ever ridden. But they, from birth, practically could see my passion for horses. And luckily, again, my good luck, they helped me follow my passion.
It's so wonderful to have supportive parents like that.
It was. My dad was great.
And so then tell me about your years with George. How long did you stay with him?
I stayed with George forever. I'm still with George. Call him up if you need advice.
Oh, I love it.
But you wanted to ask about the horse thing in the medal finals. The first medal finals I won, I was on my other quarter horse, a horse called Milltown. And the sport was changing. I won in 69 the finals with Milltown at the Garden. But then Milt was getting old. His stride was short. The courses were becoming set in a way where you had to do the right striding. You know, in the early days, we didn't care how many strides we did. We just galloped around. But then it became the 4 to the 3 or the bending 6. You know, now it's a science. But it was just beginning in those days. And for the medal finals in my final year as a junior, and George said, "You can't ride Milt. His stride is too short." I'm crying. I wanted to ride Milt. A great friend of mine who lived in the same town in Michigan, a lovely woman who you know, Christine Jones, who became Christine Tauber and was the president of the American Federation for several years. She was a great friend of mine, and she loaned me one of her jumpers, a horse called Aka. And I rode him in the final.
And then that was the year you won, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so then take me through the journey of going from equitation finals, because it was only with, if I'm not mistaken, was it about 7 years later that you went to the World Cup final? 1979, I think, is when you went to your first World Cup final. So how did that journey happen from equitation to Grand Prix jumpers?
To Grand Prix jumpers. Well, in those days, if amateur riders had a lot of money and loved horses, most of them didn't. There were no small jumper divisions. You had to go right into junior jumper or amateur jumper, and that was 5 feet high. There was no children's, low children's, subterranean children's. There's nothing like that to start. So a lot of people asked me to ride their horses. I was a catch rider. And that was such wonderful opportunity. I got to ride many hunters, many jumpers for many people. And that helped build my career under George's tutelage, teaching me how to be a jumper rider. And I believe it was in 1977 or 78, I wanted to start my own farm. I was still with George, but I wanted to start my own thing where I had some grooms of my own who would take care of the horses. And the reason I wanted to do that was that with various owners, the care or the shoeing or the preparation, I was starting to realize that I wanted to do it my own way. And I think that everybody reaches that point where if mistakes are going to be made, you want them to be your own mistakes so that you can learn from them, things that you can control. So I started my own business, and I had a few juniors, and maybe this was after the first World Cup finals. I'm getting my dates mixed up. But in any event, everything was evolving. George Morris had a wonderful horse called the Jones Boy. And he was the one I rode in that first World Cup finals. And I also had a wonderful woman from North Carolina, Mrs. Clark. And her daughter, Caroline Clark, rode with me. I trained her in the juniors. And they owned another jumper for me named Pantheon. And I took Jones Boy and Pantheon to that first World Cup finals. And it was my first time to Europe. It was my first time internet. It was wow, I can barely remember it. It was like a whirlwind. But yeah, I did well. And the biggest thing was I won a car. That was the most amazing prize. And still is. When the show gives a car, it's just an amazing thing because you have it every day. It doesn't sit on a shelf like a trophy. You don't spend it like prize money. You have it. You can drive it every day. It was wonderful.
And I was going to ask, so it was also, I was curious how it felt for you because not only was it your first World Cup final, it was the first World Cup final that ever happened.
It was amazing.
So what was that experience like?
I remember walking into, it was in Gothenburg, Sweden, walking into the arena, and the smell of the flowers was just overwhelming. The decoration, the preparation they had done for it. We had been to indoors in America, but it was nothing like that. And the crowds were unbelievable. It was overwhelming. And then seeing all the great European riders, and Hugo Simone was the one who eventually won it. And he was, you could hardly even say hi to him as this little thing from America. Hello.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering for you on the international circuit right away. And these are your heroes that you're riding with. Was there any second guessing? Am I in the right place? Did you feel like that all went away once you got on the horse and you started riding? Or I always wonder what that would have been like, just the nerves.
I thought I could beat him. I went over there totally ready to win.
I love it. Well, and from what I understand, there was a jump off and it was just that the crowd did some sort of crazy noise banging with their feet. And that's what scared Jones Boy. And so you had a rail. Is that?
That's pretty accurate. First of all, after that first year, they changed the format. They put in a coefficient where you couldn't really have a sudden death jump off anymore. Anyhow, the schooling area was under the grandstands. And the announcer said, we have what we call the Swedish bomb. And we're wondering what that is. And all of the spectators started stamping their feet. And we were under the grandstand. The roar of this reverberation of stamping feet made my thoroughbred, the Jones Boy, ballistic. I knew going into the ring I couldn't possibly go clean. He was so wild and so crazy. Couldn't think straight. But that's the way it was. Yeah. Learned some lessons from that.
Yeah, it sounds like you just took it all in stride. And I was going to say second place is pretty darn good for your first time out in a World Cup final.
I was so happy with that and just wanted to do more.
By the same token, I was wondering, as a woman at that time, how many women were riding at the top of the sport? Were you pretty much a pioneer?
Early on, not too many. But then as time went on, it was so exciting to realize that we were in the one sport, maybe there's one other, which is shooting, the only sport where men and women compete equally. Of course, the horse is the equalizer. But it's very exciting to be in this sport.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I spoke with Beth Underhill and Jill Henselwood and BZ Madden, and all the women I've spoken with have said, I never felt like I was an underdog because I was a woman. It just didn't even enter my head. And yet I think people from the outside looking in think this is pretty impressive that you're competing against men at this level and you're the winners. So in those early days, did you feel that women were welcomed? Like nobody cared?
In America, yes. In Europe, because we had a lot of women riders, maybe not at that level, but because of the hunters, a lot of women rode. And in Europe at that time, there were not many women riders even, and certainly not at the high level. So they always were sort of shocked if we beat them. I remember Ludger Beerbaum later on at La Bolle when I won the Grand Prix. He looked at me and said, "You were really fast." And I'm like, "No, Ludger." Like, what do you think? I couldn't go fast?
Yeah. I thought you were going to say to him, you were really slow.
I should have.
So I wanted to shift gears a little bit because I know you qualified for the 1980 Olympics team. And that was the year that the Olympics were in Russia. It was fun to look up the history. In fact, 67 countries boycotted the Olympic Games that year because of the fact that Russia had invaded Afghanistan. For you having qualified, what did that feel like? I'm just trying to picture, there's the disappointment that you don't get to go with the team. But I was also wondering, just processing that world event even happening, because I don't think there had been a boycott for the Olympics prior to that, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think so either. Well, as I said, I had the World Cup finals. That was my first time competing in Europe. And I hadn't competed since that. And instead of going to Russia, the U.S. Equestrian team put together a summer tour in Europe, which included Hickstead, Paris, Aachen, Dublin. And it was Bert Denemethy's last tour. He ran it. He decided where we'd go. He coached it. And what an opportunity that was for me. I got to go all around Europe. I mean, that was the summer that made my life, and probably was a better experience all around than going to the Olympics. I was very sorry I didn't get to go. But then after that summer tour, I just felt so lucky, so appreciative to have gotten that experience.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you'd gone to all those countries. That seems like a pretty good trade-off, actually.
It was wonderful.
And I was touched by the fact that I read somewhere that when you were in Dublin, you had just a rousing support from the crowd.
Because my name was Katie Monahan.
Yes.
I was Irish.
I appreciated that because I actually am Irish as well as Canadian. And I know the first time I went to Dublin, I said I felt like I'd gone home. I really understood my roots. So I can fully appreciate what it must have been like for you to be so warmly welcomed there.
Lovely.
And I wanted to move on to some of your mounts. I see that you won the American Invitational in 1983 with Noreen, 1985 the Governor, 1988 Special Envoy. So first off, I love some of your names. I was going to ask you, did you come up with the names or did somebody else? Because they are all quite clever.
Noreen came with that name.
Okay.
When I first started my business, I needed a Grand Prix horse. So I went to two of the fathers. I trained juniors. And I went to two fathers. And I said, if I put in this amount of money, will you match me so that I can go to Europe with a sum and buy a horse? And they said they would. So I went to Europe and I bought Noreen. And Noreen was a trotter, had trotter blood. And I got him for a good price because he was so difficult to ride. He was at that time being shown by a great Dutch rider named Johan Heinz. And Johan didn't like him and didn't have much success on him because if you tried to take his mouth coming to the jump, he would break into a mad trot. And you would trot the 6-foot oxer.
Oh, goodness.
So it was a little hair-raising, but I loved him. And the two families that bought into him, and we had just the best year of our lives because he was so wild. He became Horse of the Year in 1982. He won and won, but they were wild rides. And one of the mothers, she couldn't even watch. She had to go behind the scenes when I went. And the other one, if something happened, she'd duck down under the chair. They just couldn't watch. He was so wild. But again, great memories, great instincts. The other two horses, the Governor and Special Envoy, were owned by one of my greatest sponsors in those days, Mrs. Avril Harriman. And of course, she named the horses because Governor Harriman, of course, was named after her husband, the governor. And Special Envoy, Governor Harriman was the Special Envoy to FDR, envoy to Russia in the days. So Special Envoy was also named after her husband.
Wow, I love the connections there.
Nice, huh?
Tell me a little bit about those rides.
Well, the Governor, again, I got a great relation going with Johan Heinz, who had been the rider of Noreen. And so when I went to Europe to shop for horses, I always went to Johan. And he had the Governor, who I fell in love with because he was so careful. He never wanted to touch a fence. But when I got him home, and I was new to going out and picking my own horses, I realized that he didn't have a ton of scope, which means the big wide oxers were hard for it. So how do you get scope? You get pace. So I would fly around the courses, fly at the big officers. He would leap into the air, not wanting to touch them, and he could make them. And I had great success on him. He was a lovely horse. He was easy to ride. He had great heart. He wouldn't be an Olympic horse or maybe even a horse for big shows like Aachen, but the national shows here in America, he was fantastic.
So I was curious, at this point, you were still training with George?
Now I had my own farm, was getting a bigger and bigger business of training students, both juniors and amateurs, in hunters and jumpers and equitation. But as I said, George has remained one of my best friends and mentors and someone to give me advice if I need it. I have to say on this podcast, I'm so saddened for our industry that George is no longer at the horse shows, because he always had something good and interesting and educational to say. And the kids could have benefited greatly from him.
Well, I feel like so many of us grew up on his book.
And his voice. I have his voice in my ear all the time.
That too. As a Canadian, I didn't get to hear him as much, but for sure, that book was well read and well used by most trainers that I knew. So I concur with you. I feel like it's really a shame that he's not helping you. He is still helping you, but not at the shows.
Us.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I guess I was asking you, was he still helping you? Because I kind of never really know, as a trainer and an international rider, who helps you on the ground? Now I know you had your husband, you have your son, but when you were making that step and having your own farm, did you have a really good ground person that helped you in terms of setting jumps and giving you their feedback to say, yeah, we think the horse is ready? How did that all happen?
You're going to laugh when I tell you this. Oh. I had a great team of people led by John Madden.
I love it.
He was my ground man, and he helped me in every way, helped me with my farm. And we also, John hired Pancho Lopez, who was just inducted into the Hall of Fame last year because he was a great barn manager, communicator, horseman. He was like a vet himself. He just did such a great job for me.
I was speaking with Randy Roy. I think he told me he also worked for you at some point. Is that correct?
A little bit. I did a lot of riding for and collaborating with Ian Miller. In those days, I rode some of his hunters at the Royal. And Randy at that time was working for Ian, and we all did stuff together, some business things together.
I think that's what's interesting about the show jumping industry. It feels like there's a real generosity of spirit, and I'm always fascinated when I hear that somebody helped their competitor, and it was even across borders, and just that there is this, I guess, collaboration just because the horse is what ties everybody together. So I'm loving hearing that you did that, because I didn't realize that you had ridden some of Ian's horses. I'm guessing that was when he was at Dwyer Hill, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then I was also wanting to ask you a little bit about, in terms of a type, it doesn't sound like you had a type. Is that correct?
As I said in the beginning, when I went out, before I chose my own horses, I rode any horse that anybody wanted me to ride. So I didn't have a type. When I went out to choose my own horses, I had to learn through trial and error. I bought a big horse through Johann Heinz, strong, heavy, a type I would never pick today. But when I tried him, he could jump a house. Never sat on a horse that had such tremendous jump. But when I got him home, I realized that he didn't like the Liverpool or the water jump. And no matter what I did and how I trained and how hard I worked, when I went in and there was a Liverpool or a water jump, it was questionable in my mind if I was going to be able to get him over. He was so strong and so contrary. And dealing with mostly thoroughbreds, I hadn't had that experience before where a horse just didn't want to do it. When I got to Palm Beach, one of the early years, there was a big water jump. And I went to my great friend, Ian Miller, and I said, Ian, will you ride him over the water jump the first time for me? He said, of course I will. So Ian went in the class, got him over the water, and the horse grabbed the bit, jumped out of the ring, and took him back to the stable.
Oh my, that had to be a sight.
Then I had to admit, okay, maybe every horse isn't for me. I had to give in a little bit. And in those days, I was just getting to know Henri Prudent, my future husband.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, this horse, I said, how will I ever sell this horse? And actually, Mrs. Harriman had bought him for me. And Henri said, in Europe, there are horses that specialize only in puissance, when they had a puissance at every show. And he could jump 7 feet with his eyes closed, this horse.
Wow.
So Henri and I went to Europe together, and we were able to trade. This horse's name was Black Gold. We were able to trade Black Gold for an older mare named the Empress.
Oh,
and Mrs. Harriman named her the Empress. And we got her home. And with the Empress, I was able to win a lot of good Grand Prix in America. And we eventually sold her well, and she went on to win with the next rider. So there's a place for every horse.
Mm-hmm.
But Black Gold's place wasn't with me.
No.
He went over and became a good puissance horse in Europe, a very good one. Never see any water anymore.
Lucky him.
Yes.
So I did want to ask you a little bit about, when did you and Henri meet, and how did that all develop? Because I was thinking you would have been, and still are, a real power couple in the horse world. And it's a challenging life. So it's hard when both of you are riders and both of you are competing and both of you are training. So tell me, how did that start and how did that evolve?
Henri was working in Switzerland for Gerhard Eder, who's a very big dealer. And Henri was a great rider himself. He's Grand Prix winner. He was on the short list for the French jumping team and 3-day team, has an extensive background, all sorts of horse activities. And there was a man, he's an American, but lived a lot in France and wanted to import French horses to be sold in America. So he asked Henri if he would do it. And Henri didn't want to do it because he didn't speak one word of English. But his partner, Gerhard Eder, said, go to America. You'll, meet some new contacts. If you don't like it, stay a few months, meet the people, see how it goes over there, and then come back. And so Henri did that. And as luck would have it, Mr. Graham, the owner, the man who wanted to import the horses, his farm was in Marshall, Virginia, which is about 20 minutes from where I live, Middleburg. And I was in a show in Richmond called Virginia State Horse Show. And I was riding Norin, who I had just gotten from Europe. And I saw this really cute guy riding around. And I knew he must be a foreigner because he had green riding pants on. Nobody wore green riding pants. But he was pretty cute in those green riding pants. And after the Grand Prix, which I won, and he was second, he came to see me with Mr. Graham to say that he knew the horse I was riding. He had ridden it in France. It got sold to Holland. And so you know how things go in the world. And as luck would have it, I spoke French because I had taken it from 3rd grade through college. And so even though he didn't speak English, we got along fine. We saw each other again at the Upperville Horse Show, which was a month or two later. And, just then he went to the same shows I went to and got to know each other. And actually, with Black Gold, I asked him to come to my farm because he was very, and still is, excellent at long lining the horses. And he explained to me that you're much stronger with the long lines than you are just riding them. So I said, please come long line this horse for me. And he long lined him in the ring. And when Black Gold saw the Liverpool, he left the ring with Henri digging his heels in. There were 2 trenches coming out of the ring, up the hill and back. Anyway.
That's quite a visual.
We had to fill in those trenches.
I would have to say, if you believe in karma and things happening for a reason, you were a couple meant to meet.
The turns you take in life, the choices you make.
I was also interested to see that you had gone to university for a year and then decided, no, I'm making this my passion. And I was thinking, I spoke with Beezy Madden and Callan Solom in the last 2 weeks, and both of them were the same. They had put off, I think they had both been accepted to university and had scholarships, but like you, they just knew that there was another destiny for them. And I was thinking that was probably fairly brave back in those days, giving up.
I always wanted to go to college, and my dad wanted me to go to college, and I went. And I went near George Morris. I went out to New Jersey, to Rutgers, the Douglas University. And my grades went from very good grades to very bad grades because I just wanted to be with horses and ride at George's and do whatever I could with horses. And I knew by then that that was going to be my livelihood. That was going to be my job for the rest of my life. And I called my dad. I said, Dad, I just don't want to go to school. I know what I want to do. He said, okay. It was great. So it wasn't a hard decision to go and then to not go. I did what I thought I should and what I wanted. And I realized I didn't want that at all.
It sounds like these decisions have shaped your life and that you've always known, been very determined and known exactly what it is you want along the way.
Yeah, it's funny. If I don't know what to do about something, I always say to myself, I'm just going to wait a little bit because I'll know when it's right. And I just let it come to me.
It's like, let it sit and then the path will arrive. So I was also interested in asking you a little bit about when, as far as making these decisions, it sounds like you were always very brave. Did you ever have any fear on these horses? Because you were telling me some pretty challenging rides that you had. Would you say you were always very brave from an early age, or was it something that you developed, or was it just you had confidence in your ride?
You know, again, from another lifetime, from the moment I started riding, from the moment I can remember, I could almost always make the horse do what I wanted him to do. For me, it wasn't even about riding. It was getting with that horse and us, the two of us having a plan and doing it. Yeah, I just always felt like I was never scared. Never.
That's interesting. I also, I guess, wanted to shift gears to asking you a little bit about your training techniques, because you obviously were named as the Coach of the Year. Was that back in the same year that you were inducted into the Hall of Fame? Or that was 2016, you were inducted into the Show Jumping Hall of Fame. It was earlier than that. Okay. You, like many good riders, I feel, have given back to the sport tremendously as far as training is concerned. What would you say, because this is my observation as an older rider, is I feel sometimes that the sport has changed dramatically in terms of people coming up through the ranks and what they know about the horses and horsemanship. I'd love to hear from your perspective what you've observed, because you've been coaching and training riders for quite some time. Where do you think this has come from, and where do you think it's going?
Again, good fortune to ride with George all those years, because when I wasn't in a lesson, I was watching a lesson. You know, George was very tough. But what you have to remember is, when you're teaching somebody, it's your job to keep them safe. And when I'm teaching somebody who doesn't do what I tell them to do and is sort of out of control, I'm really tough on them. Because if they can't control the horse, they're going to get hurt. And they might hurt someone else. And I really got that from George. I saw him instill in people things that they could do that they really couldn't unless you had instilled them with maybe a fear of him or whatever, but that they would do what he said. And in the end, they would learn how to do it and then how to be better riders and more in control. So I learned a lot of his technique. And I also combined with that my knowledge about the horses and what I wanted to achieve, or what I would achieve with that horse if I had it. And then I try to help the rider understand how it could be better and what they can do about it. I teach people how to train horses, which is my lifelong passion. And that's what keeps us in the sport. If you want to be in the sport to win a blue ribbon, it's a very shallow goal. Because if you can train a horse and do everything right and bring a horse from a low level to a high level, then you achieve all your goals, and winning is a part of it. But winning can't be the goal, because we see that too much now, equitation, hunters. And then when the kids are out of their junior years, they can't wait to stop and go do something else. I try to instill in all my kids that love of the horse and the love of training the horse and the love of figuring out how to make that horse better. And so that's the whole point of my training. And we see it less and less now. We see trainers who don't care. And if the horse is difficult, get rid of it. Let's buy another one. They don't train kids how to train horses. And then again, with all this animal rights crap, it takes away your ability to train horses. not to
Mhm.
be cruel with them, but be strong enough to influence their behavior.
Mhm. I know. I think people forget that it's a 1,200-pound animal. And as you say, they can do some serious damage if they are out of control.
For sure.
And I had this conversation with Jen Hamilton about a month ago. And she talked about that she found nowadays it's more of a hobby. It's just another activity that children do on top of other sports. Whereas growing up, it felt like it was a calling. It still feels for me as an amateur that it's a calling. When people describe it as my hobby, I cringe. I'll say it's my passion and my sport. Even though I'm not a professional, for me, it's everything. That time I spend with my horse and knowing all his little intricacies. And you can't get to that without spending time with them and observing them and knowing what their likes and dislikes are. For me, he's like my child, I think. So
Manners that are so important for your child. It's the same with the horse.
So do you find it challenging nowadays teaching because of the difference in the attitude, or how do you approach that?
I find it challenging, the training of the horse at the horse shows with people and stewards. I guess there's this new thing where you're never supposed to use your crop. And I teach my kids if they have a misbehavior, if the horse stops at the jump, and the rules are you can hit them twice. I say, you've got to give them a good smack, because it's like your little child, your real human child, walks out into the road. You grab him and jerk him back. That might look mean, but what's the alternative? He gets hit by a car? All right, so what's the alternative? He stops and crashes into a fence and you get hurt, you and the horse? You know, you have to be able to train the animal. That's a challenge right now. I wanted to talk to you about this, and this might be a good time. Perfect. Last year, I started a foundation, a 501c3 called Road to the Top. And my friend Laura Kraut is the other person helping me with this for right now. We are going to expand after the first year with other professionals. But we search out talented people from all over the country, American, I say young riders, not juniors. I'm looking for people like myself when I was that age who have already decided that this sport is all they want to do for the rest of their life. I'm looking for those people who have gotten limited experience because of maybe where they are in the country, can't afford to get to the big shows, the big trainers, can't afford a horse that can be competitive at the higher levels. We're searching for those riders, and the foundation, will pay the expenses on 3 horses and the expenses of the rider. Laura and I give our training for free. We supply the horses with various horses that we have in training for these kids to ride and show, and they stay with us. At 1 year, we have an evaluation. At 6 months, we have a small evaluation. At a year, we decide if we'll take them on or if we'll place them in a job somewhere. We are looking for the future of our U.S. equestrian team. As you know, it's harder and harder for young professionals to get to the top of the sport because they can't afford to buy the top jumpers. And we have a lot of great amateurs who can afford to buy the top jumpers, but often they're not the people who want to stay in the sport for the rest of their lives and lead the team into the future. We're looking to develop future team leaders.
Well, I guess I'll have 2 questions. So how many riders are you looking for, and how will you fund the horse part?
Laura, after Florida last year, Laura selected Carly McCutcheon, who was a junior who had won the medal finals. I chose Trent McGee, who was a young professional in California working for an equitation barn. Both came highly recommended. We had seen that they were highly motivated. All they want to do is be on the team one day and give back. And so we are giving each one of them a year. Carly was clear yesterday in the 2-star, had a rail in the jump off, but great with a horse that Laura gave to her. Trent McGee in the U25 Grand Prix the first week had a light 4 faults and ended up with a low ribbon, like 14. He was fantastic. He won a class this week in Wellington. For now, we're supplying the horses, and we are able to, or we have been able to up till now, just with horses that are sent to us, or some of the clients' horses, if the client can't be there except for once a month or whatever, we make it work to get 3. And they don't have to be great horses. They can be very difficult horses. As a matter of fact, I look for those. I want them to learn everything, not just silver spoon in the mouth. Anyway, so this foundation, so far with this, we're not even up to a year yet. Laura's very happy with Carly. She's learning a ton. I'm very happy with Trent. He's, I'm making him struggle, and he's risen to the occasion every time. So hopefully we can expand. Other trainers have expressed interest in taking on a young rider. I have a committee, including Margie Engel and Skylar Riley, a committee that looks over the applications. We've had about 30 applications so far, and we are going over those applications to see if we feel like any of the students would be worthy of coming onto the program after this year. It's going to expand, and it's going to be a very interesting program, only because the sport is so expensive. The other thing that's changed, Catherine, in our sport is that, as I explained to you when I was younger, I did a lot of catch riding. People who love to own horses, like Mrs. Harriman, like the Patrick Butlers, who supplied all the horses for Conrad and Joe in the day. We don't have those anymore. The very wealthy families want to do it for their children. And their children ride in the children's jumper, the low juniors, the medium juniors. It's gotten so watered down in our country that, and I don't mean that in a bad way, it offers a place for everyone who wants to ride. And then sadly, that money that might have been to buy someone, we still have some great owners, but the money that would have been to buy, like my rider now, Kathleen Driscoll, who has done so well. I'm looking for somebody rich to buy a great horse for her, because I've supplied her nice horses over the years. Don Stewart, my good friend, who's also on the board of directors of Road to the Top, has supplied some good horses. But we need now that next step, which is to be able to get either a great young horse that we can develop, or maybe an older Grand Prix horse that's on its way down that can take her to the 5-star. It's a process. And of course, to be at the highest levels takes a lot of money. Road to the Top is going to get them to that level, and then we'll have to take the next step.
I think that's a fabulous foundation. I really applaud you and Laura for starting that, because I think what a gift.
And I wanted to say on your podcast that you can learn more about us at roadtothetop, all one word, .org.
Perfect. But I just think what a fabulous gift. It's not even just that you're mentoring them, because that's a big deal, that it's the two of you and Laura Kraut. I mean, I can't even imagine getting your tutelage, but also just the fact that you're going to help them develop and ride horses and get people potentially to buy them. Because I do think it was interesting in the past, it seemed like if you wanted an opportunity and you didn't have the funding, you put together a syndicate, and that was a way to fund a horse. I would say that we have the same problem in Canada. One thing that I've noticed in the States is at least you have much more depth to the number of riders. I feel like you could put together 4 Olympic teams in any given year with just the number of good riders you have, but maybe not the mounts. Whereas in Canada, we just don't have that.
I can't agree with you 100% there.
Okay.
Because we can put together teams, but we want to put together winning teams for the highest level. So far to this day in our country, it's McLean, Kent, Laura, and fourth is always the hard one. It was Beasy. And for years, nobody had a chance to get on the team at the highest levels, because those carried. And then we tried to put together other teams, and we almost didn't qualify for the Olympics in Paris. Do you recall that? We went right down to the Pan Am Games, where we had to put together very best team we could, and we snuck in, which was great. But I agree with you. We can put together 10 teams. But I'm talking about not just surviving at Aachen, but going clear. You know what I'm saying?
You'd like to represent your country well, not just represent your country.
Yeah.
Good for you. I think that's a fabulous idea. And as I say, I applaud you and Laura for doing that. And I hope that maybe that will inspire Canadians to do something similar at home.
I'm so glad Ian is the chef to keep for the team because he's fabulous.
Mm-hmm. Well, did want to ask you, shifting gears back to your riding days, I do remember reading that you had a really serious accident in 1990, and it was described as a near fatal accident. And I wondered, when that happened, was there ever a thought in your head of leaving the sport? It doesn't sound like it. Because I feel like
I woke up in the hospital, they had shaved my head. I sat up in bed and looked in the mirror, and I'm like, whoa, who's that? And the doctor came in, he said, you'll never ride again.
Really?
I said, wait a minute. I remember I qualified my first horse and the Grand Prix isn't until tomorrow. I can get there.
Well, what's cute about that is, does it feel like you've earned your stripes as a rider until you've had the near fatal accident and hit your head? And I was surprised to hear that was the first big crash you ever had, if I'm not mistaken.
I was never hurt. I was very tough. This wasn't a bad crash, but it was called a rotational injury. I had my hat on. I was in the ring. Mm-hmm. And I fell off and hit my head. And if you can imagine your brain like a ball inside the skull, it just turns a little. Mm-hmm. And I had a broken blood vessel, which anywhere else in your body would be a little bruise. But in the head, it becomes a leak that's a subdural hematoma. And if it's not seen to right away, it can damage your brain. It can be, and then it can kill you. But I was so lucky because it was a slow leak and I got up and walked out of the ring. I saw my husband out in the paddock and I guess I said to him, I don't remember this part. I remember everything else. I said, I don't think I'm right. I think you should take me to the hospital. And then I collapsed and they got me to the hospital right away. There was a neurosurgeon there right away. They opened up my head right away. So I had no brain damage, but I had a little bit of a depth perception problem for about a year.
That would have made it very interesting, jumping jumps.
Well, it was interesting because I realized that I could see my distance about 10 strides away, but as I got closer to the jump, I lost where I was. So I had to learn to just lock into 10 strides away and stick with it.
That must have made you a very good rider.
You know, after that head injury, I got a wonderful mare named Belladonna, and she was a great, careful winner. But if I was 4 inches too long at the jump, she'd stop and throw me off. So I learned to be accurate. She was just what I needed at that moment.
I did want to ask you about, there was a horse called Partly Cloudy. Again, loved the name because it was a gray. I thought that is just a fabulous name for a gray. And I watched a YouTube video of you at Hickstead. So it must have been the Derby.
Wasn't that fun? Yeah.
So what year was that? And there were 2 of you that jumped off. Is that correct? It was phenomenal to watch. So what year was that? And what was the story on that horse?
I can't remember what year it was. She was a horse owned by the Firestone family, Allison Firestone's parents. Mm-hmm. Allison was still too little to ride her, so we ended up selling her at the end of that year. But she wasn't Irish, but she was like an Irish fox hunter. She just had a big stride and was super brave and scopy and ended up being a terrific Derby horse. And of course, I grew up fox hunting. So when I did my first Derby, I had already jumped many banks and ditches and waters. And it was just so fun to continue it. You think of the poor kids today, they never even ride on a field. Trent, my road to the top guy who grew up in California, when we went out on the big Derby field here in Wellington over at the Polo Club, where the Derby jumps are on an old polo field, he said, I have never been on a field like this. I was like, well, good luck. Get out there and ride. By fire.
I was going to ask you about the footing change because I, too, myself did grow up with grass, and I even loved the idea that we had to hork our horses on certain days, even being in the lower amateur jumper classes. And I wonder, with all of this all-weather footing, I mean, it's fabulous because you can show all the time, but do you feel like that changes the rider's
sense of different feels? It does. You know, I have a grass slate hill at home, and we ride on the grass all the time. And sometimes we jump out there, and I don't put studs in the horse's shoes unless we're schooling something big. But I say to the kids, don't let your horses slip. Feel it. If you pull up too fast, they'll slip. If you turn too sharp, they'll slip. Feel the slippage and don't let them slip. And I don't think kids feel that today because they never have to. It's an experience they don't get.
So it's another skill set that can be lacking.
Yeah.
Do you see it at some point in North America being there are no grass rings? Thank God for Spruce Meadows. I don't think they're ever going to move their grass to the all-weather footing. But do you see a day where that's all that will be offered unless you do go to those events?
It's coming.
Mhm.
It's coming. And many of the shows are putting in the synthetic footing because of rainy days they've had where their grass field became too deep or too slippery. You can understand the show managers saying to themselves, if I just put in all-weather footing, I'll never miss a day again.
Right.
And that happens.
Mm-hmm. So just a couple more questions that I had from listeners for you. One specifically was asking about how would you balance the getting practice for the rider with the horse's well-being in mind, because you feel like there's only so many jumps a horse has in them. You don't want to feel like you're taking all the jumps out of them, but then your rider needs practice. How would you suggest they balance that? Would that be like with rails on the ground, or just wondered what you might have as a suggestion?
First of all, I'll tell you in my experience, growing up with one horse, doing the junior hunter division, which was 5 classes, 4 jumping and 1 under saddle, doing the equitation division, which was medal Maclay, and then your equitation age level on the flat and over fences, and sometimes the USET class, with one horse in 3 days, doing maybe 10 classes. Wow. And we seem to think that, of course, we only showed maybe once a month. That was the difference. But we seem to think that horses are very fragile. If you have good shoeing, if you ride on decent footing, if you don't do crazy things, your horse, if he's a basically sound horse, should be able to jump a couple times a week and then go to the horse show. I think if you have a soundness problem, you've got to fix it before you can go on. You can't go on with an unsound horse, or they can't hold up. But if you have a pretty sound horse and you do rails on the ground twice a week, you jump twice a week, go to the show and show in one division, I think you're just fine. I think you're all right. You only need to be afraid if you see his legs changing or his demeanor changing. You have to recognize if he's getting sore, and then
Fair enough.
Your program.
And then my other question for you was, what keeps you so passionate about the sport today? Because it seems like you haven't lost any of your drive and passion. Just wondered, where does that burning fire come from?
I still love to train horses. I love to train kids to train horses. And I have a great life. Wouldn't change a thing, except if I could own an airplane. That's the only thing I would change.
I was wondering how you balance. You have 3 locations. From what I understand, you're in Rosières-aux-Salines in France. You're in Wellington, and you're also in Virginia. So how do you get from spot to spot?
We have our system and our traditions. We only go to Florida in the winter. We have thought about going to Spain. We have been out to California, but too far away. Plus, we have our little house here. So Florida, home in the spring to Virginia. And then depending on the riders I have and their level of experience, if they're ready, we do a European tour in the summer.
Oh, how fun.
And if they're not ready, we have a show schedule that we do, which includes Kentucky and Upperville and Traverse City and Tryon sometimes. So we have our places that we like to go, and we just do that every year. And it's always fun with new students, new horses, new goals.
Katie, I really want to thank you so much for taking time out to meet with me today. I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best of success with your riders and also with this new foundation. Again, it's called Road to the Top, and roadtothetop.org is the website that you can go to learn more. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, too.
If you'd like to learn more about upcoming guests or recent podcasts, please follow me on Instagram at Horsetails with Kat.